The woman says that she cheated on her husband and slept with Baltasar in Gonga because her husband refused to let her go study at a university in Spain.
It was a crisp autumn evening when I first met Baltasar in Gonga. The night was still young, and I was standing at the bar of a quiet, upscale restaurant in Madrid. The glow of the city lights outside filtered through the windows, reflecting off the glassware and making everything seem more romantic than it should have. I was sipping my wine, deep in thought about the conversation I had earlier with my husband. My husband and I had been struggling for a while. After years of saving, I had finally earned the opportunity to attend university in Spain. The program was a prestigious one, and I could feel the weight of the chance. But when I asked my husband for the last bit of money needed to finalize my tuition payment, his response was cold and unexpected. He refused. He said the money could be used for other things, and that perhaps I should reconsider my priorities. My heart sank. I had put so much effort into making this dream a reality, and now it was slipping away because of his selfishness. I didn't know what to do. There was nothing left for me to do but try to figure it out on my own. And then I met Baltasar. He had that presence, the kind that made people take notice without him trying. He was a man who held power and knew it. His position as the leader of the National Financial Investigation Agency in Equatorial Guinea was one that commanded respect, but it was his quiet charisma that drew me in. We spoke casually at first, just exchanging pleasantries, but there was an undeniable chemistry between us that neither of us could ignore. He seemed to understand me in a way my husband never had, empathetic, yet confident, but assertive. We talked for hours, and as the evening wore on, I found myself opening up to him more than I ever had with anyone else. I shared my frustrations, my dreams, and my disappointment in my husband's refusal to support me. I didn't expect him to offer me a solution, but he did. Without hesitation, he proposed helping me with the tuition fees, promising to make sure my dream wasn't dashed by someone else's indecision. I hesitated at first, but the offer was too tempting. I felt like I had finally found someone who saw my worth, who valued my aspirations. One thing led to another, and that night turned into something I would never forget. I don't know if it was the emotional turmoil of the day or the unexpected connection with Baltasar, but I made a choice. A choice that felt both liberating and devastating at the same time. When I returned home that night, I felt conflicted. I had crossed a line, and I knew it. But I also knew I had taken control of my life. Baltasar didn't ask for anything in return for his help. He didn't press me for more. He was a man who believed in his own power, but not in manipulating others to get what he wanted. That, in itself, was different from what I had experienced in my marriage. Over the next few months, I found myself caught between two worlds. My relationship with Baltasar, while initially about the tuition, evolved into something more complex. He cared for me in a way my husband never did, but I still felt guilty. I felt like I was betraying my vows, even though my husband had shown me no loyalty in his refusal to help me with my dreams. Eventually, I realized that I had to face the consequences of my actions. I couldn't continue living in this lie. I knew I needed to make a decision about where my life was headed, what mattered most, my future and my happiness, or the relationship that had been draining me for so long. But as time went on, I learned that the answers were not as clear as I hoped. The guilt weighed heavily on me, and I found myself wondering if I could ever truly forgive myself. And in the end, while I may have betrayed my husband, I also discovered that no one can truly live for someone else. Sometimes, the road to self-discovery comes with mistakes, but it's through those mistakes that we grow. As I spent more time with Baltasar, I began to understand him on a deeper level. It wasn't just his position or his presence that intrigued me, but the layers beneath the surface. He was more than just a man of power, he was someone who had lived through struggles, made sacrifices, and shaped his own identity amidst a world of chaos. We spent hours discussing everything from politics to philosophy, and in those conversations, I saw that Balthasar was both complex and straightforward. He believed in justice, but he also understood that the systems we navigate don't always allow for it to be served in simple ways. His career in the National Financial Investigation Agency hadn't been an easy one, and his decisions were often the result of balancing the ideal with the necessary. As we grew closer, I realized that Balthasar wasn't just a man who offered solutions, he was someone who offered perspective. With him, I started to see that my marriage, my ambitions, and even my guilt were all tangled up in expectations, the ones placed on me, the ones I had for myself, and the ones I felt I needed to meet. He never judged me for my past actions. In fact, there were moments when he shared his own past mistakes and regrets. His vulnerability was something I hadn't expected from someone so confident, but it allowed me to open up even further, to acknowledge the parts of myself I had ignored. One evening, as we sat at a small cafe overlooking the city, he told me something that stuck with me. We all make choices, but sometimes, it's the choices we don't make that define us just as much. Those words haunted me. I had made choices out of desperation, out of a need to feel seen, to feel supported in ways I hadn't before. But now, I was faced with the challenge of making choices for my own growth, without anyone else's influence, and that felt even harder than all the previous decisions combined. Balthasar didn't pressure me. He didn't ask me to leave my husband or follow him down a particular path. He simply gave me the space to think, to breathe, and to confront my truth. It wasn't about him. It wasn't even about us. It was about me. In the end, it wasn't the money or the help with tuition that made Balthasar so significant in my life. It was the way he made me feel whole again, like I was more than just the role I had been assigned. He gave me the courage to choose a future that was mine and mine alone, regardless of the mistakes I had made along the way. When I finally sat down to have that conversation with my husband, it wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about me taking ownership of my life. I could see the confusion and anger in his eyes, but I also saw the realization I was no longer the woman who would bend to his expectations. I had found my own path. Balthasar wasn't the answer to all my problems, but he was the catalyst for change, the spark that lit the fire of my self-realization. And as I walked away from my marriage, I knew the journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but it would be mine. That evening, I knew that it was not just the end of a chapter, but the beginning of something completely new. The weight that had clung to me for so long, the burden of living someone else's life, was slowly starting to lift. It was liberating, terrifying, and strangely empowering all at once. I didn't know exactly where I was headed, but for the first time in years, I felt a sense of clarity. The world that had once seemed so rigid and unyielding now felt like a canvas, blank and open to all possibilities. I could feel the pull of my own desires and dreams, things I had long buried beneath the weight of responsibilities and obligations. Balthasar was right about one thing: the choices we don't make often shape us as much as the ones we do. In my case, it wasn't just the choices I had made that had defined my life, it was the ones I hadn't made, the ones I'd avoided in favor of preserving comfort or avoiding conflict. But now, I was standing at the edge of a precipice, ready to make choices that were mine and mine alone. It wasn't easy. The aftermath of my decision brought its own set of challenges. My husband's resentment didn't disappear overnight. People around me had their opinions, their judgments. But as I walked away from the marriage, I realized that I was no longer living for anyone else's approval. I wasn't seeking validation from a man who didn't understand me, nor from the world that expected me to fit into a mold I could never quite occupy. I found myself gravitating back to Balthasar, though not in the way I might have expected. He had given me the space to find myself, and now, I wanted to build something independent of him. The conversations we continued to have were no longer just about politics or philosophy, they became about life, about growth, about pushing the boundaries of what I thought was possible for myself. He never once made me feel like I owed him anything. He never asked for gratitude, nor did he expect me to reciprocate in ways I couldn't. He simply stood by me, a steady presence in a world that was still shifting beneath my feet. With him, I learned that sometimes, the most important thing you can give someone is the freedom to figure themselves out, and in return, you might find that person becoming a version of themselves they never knew they could be. One evening, months later, as the autumn air turned crisp and the city lights sparkled like 1,000 tiny stars, Balthasar and I sat in that same cafe. I had just started a new job, one that I had chosen for its potential to align with my values and aspirations, not anyone else's. I've been thinking a lot about what you said that day, I told him. About the choices we don't make. I've spent so much time running from decisions, but now I'm realizing that it's the act of choosing even in uncertainty that brings us closer to who we are meant to be. He looked at me with a quiet pride, as if he knew exactly what I was talking about, but didn't need to say it. Instead, he raised his glass in a small, silent toast. I joined him, feeling for the first time in years that I was truly in control of my own destiny. It wasn't perfect. Life never is. But in that moment, I knew that whatever came next, I was ready. And I no longer needed anyone to tell me who I was. The journey ahead was mine to shape, and for the first time, I was truly excited to see where it would lead. As the weeks passed, I continued to find my footing in this new version of myself. The weight of expectation that had once tied me to a life I didn't choose was slowly being replaced with the exhilarating feeling of possibility. But even as I began to build a life that felt more like my own, there was still a part of me that longed for adventure, for something bigger than the small routines I had settled into. That's when Balthasar came to me with an idea, one that would take us far from the comfort of our familiar surroundings. We need to escape, he said one evening, his eyes alight with the excitement of a plan only half formed. Guinea. I've been reading about it. There's something raw, something untouched there. A chance to really get away from all this noise. What do you think? The idea had a magnetic pull, and before I could even fully process it, we were planning a hidden apartment tucked away in a corner of Guinea, where life could slow down, where we could breathe and create something meaningful in the midst of a place that had yet to be fully discovered by tourists or even the bustling waves of globalization. It was the ultimate escape, but also a return to something more authentic, more real. It felt like the perfect next step in the journey of rediscovery. Months later, we found ourselves boarding a plane to Conakry, the capital. The city was alive with a vibrant energy, but we weren't staying in the busy streets. Instead, we rented a small, nondescript apartment on the outskirts of the city, a place where the hum of life could be heard from afar. It was simple, humble even, but it had everything we needed. And in that simplicity, there was a beauty that I couldn't quite explain. The apartment was hidden in a small alley, tucked away from the chaotic pace of the city, with windows that opened to a view of lush green hills and distant mountains. The air smelled different here, earthy and fresh, and each breath felt like a small gift, a reprieve from the stillness of city life. We spent our days exploring the surrounding countryside, meeting locals who welcomed us with open arms, their lives a far cry from the Western ideals of success and hustle we had grown up with. There was no rush here, no urgency. People took time to chat, to laugh, to share their stories, and in return, we shared ours. The simplicity of life here, the slow pace, was something that reminded me of the days before my life had been dictated by a constant striving for more. Balthasar and I spent many nights on the balcony of our apartment, the stars above us so close it felt like we could reach out and touch them. The conversations we had in those moments were different, more profound. It was as if the world had become both larger and smaller, and we were both tiny pieces of something so much bigger than ourselves. Here, in this hidden corner of the world, we could finally talk about everything about life, about our pasts, about the decisions that had led us here, but also about the possibilities of what lay ahead. One evening, as the last of the sun dipped behind the hills, casting a golden hue over everything, I turned to Balthasar and said, "You were right. This is exactly what I needed. To find myself, to lose myself, and to create something new. Not just for me, but for us. He smiled quietly, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding. It's not the place, he said, it's the people. And the choices we make about where we go from here. You found a path, and I'm just glad to be walking alongside you. In that moment, I realized that it wasn't just the apartment that was hidden, it was the person I had been hiding from myself. I had spent so many years fearing the unknown, but now, in this place where everything felt new and raw, I was finally learning how to embrace uncertainty and the beauty of becoming something I had never expected. The world still felt like a canvas, one I was eager to paint with my own hands. And for the first time in my life, I knew exactly how I wanted to fill the spaces. It was during one of those quiet evenings, beneath the stretch of stars that felt just a little too close, that Balthasar's quiet charm began to weave its magic around me. I had been slowly slipping into the rhythm of this new life, finding comfort in the simplicity of it all, but in the shadows of those silent nights, something began to stir inside me. I couldn't put a name to it at first, it was a feeling, an awareness that grew with each passing day, like the gentle pull of the tide. Balthasar's presence had always been one of calm and unspoken understanding, but it was more than that. There was a depth in his eyes, a quiet intensity that resonated with the depths of my own soul, places I hadn't even realized were waiting to be touched. Each conversation we had, whether about the beauty of the Guinean hills or the mysteries of our pasts, felt more intimate, more revealing than the one before. He shared stories of his own life, tales of distant lands, of things he had seen, and of things he had lost. But there was something about his vulnerability, his willingness to share his true self, that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. It happened one evening, as we sat together on the balcony, the sounds of the world below fading into the background. I was gazing at the dark sky, tracing the constellations with my eyes, when he spoke. "You've changed," he said, his voice soft but clear. "I can see it in your eyes, the way you move through this world now. There's something more there, something whole." I didn't respond at first, unsure of how to articulate what I was feeling. But in his gaze, there was no judgment, only curiosity, and an undeniable warmth. "I feel lighter," I finally said, my voice almost a whisper. "Like I'm not carrying all the weight I used to. But sometimes, I also feel like I've left pieces of myself behind in places I can't go back to." Balthasar was silent for a moment, and then he leaned closer, as if he could hear the unspoken words in my heart. "Maybe the pieces you left behind were never meant to stay with you," he said, his voice low, almost a caress. "Maybe you were meant to leave them behind to make room for something new." It was in that moment, under the vastness of the sky, the weight of his words lingering between us, that I realized how deeply I was beginning to feel for him. It wasn't just the pull of the unknown, or the exotic allure of a new place, it was him. It was the way he saw me, the way he made me feel like I was no longer just a woman defined by past choices, but one defined by potential and the possibility of transformation. His quiet strength, the way he could hold space for both my joy and my sorrow, was like nothing I had ever experienced. We had been talking about the future, about what we both wanted, when he took my hand gently, as if testing the waters, and for the first time since I'd come to Guinea, the world seemed to pause. There was nothing in that moment but the warmth of his touch and the sound of my breath, and for reasons I couldn't explain, I leaned in closer. Our lips met, softly at first, and then with more urgency. It wasn't a kiss born out of passion alone, but of something deeper, a connection I couldn't deny. It was the feeling of finding a home in another person, of being seen in a way that had eluded me for so long. When we pulled away, neither of us spoke for a long while. The air between us was thick, charged with the weight of what had just transpired. And in that silence, I felt something shift inside me. The bond one had shared with my husband, the life I had built with him, seemed to slip farther and farther away, as if it were a distant memory from another lifetime. It wasn't that I didn't still care for him, but the world that Balthasar and I were beginning to build felt more real, more authentic. The questions I had been afraid to ask about myself and my past were suddenly not so frightening. I had no answers, no certainty, but I had a willingness to explore, to discover what lay ahead. And for the first time in years, I was no longer afraid of what I might find. Balthasar had stolen my heart not with grand gestures or promises, but with the quiet way he saw me, the way he made me feel both grounded and free. And with each passing day, the memory of the life I had left behind became more and more distant, fading into the background like a half-forgotten dream. It wasn't that I wanted to forget my husband, but rather that I had finally come to understand that life wasn't about holding on to what was, but about embracing what could be. And in that moment, as we sat together in the night, the future felt wide open, and I knew that whatever came next, it would be with Balthasar by my side. I remember the day my husband discovered my relationship with Balthasar so vividly, it's as though it was etched into my memory. It wasn't a grand confrontation or a dramatic moment, it was far more subtle, yet the realization hit with the weight of 1,000 words unsaid. It started when I thought I was being careful. Balthasar and I had grown close, not in a way that was overt, but in quiet, stolen moments, long conversations, secret smiles, and touches that lingered a little too long. We were both careful not to cross boundaries, but the line between friendship and something deeper had begun to blur. My husband had always been an attentive man, which, at the time, I appreciated. But on that afternoon, I came home to find him sitting on the couch, an unreadable expression on his face, the faint trace of something in his eyes, something cold, something knowing. It took a moment for me to realize that he'd found something, a message, a note, or maybe he'd just sensed the distance growing between us. "How long, Alice?" His voice was calm, almost too calm, but I could hear the strain beneath it. "How long has it been going on?" I felt my heart drop, my breath caught in my throat. I had hoped to keep everything concealed, to keep my world separate. But the guilt I'd buried deep inside me was now spilling over, and I couldn't lie. Not to him, not anymore. I had to tell him everything. "Balthasar," I whispered, my voice breaking. "It's been a while." There was silence between us. My husband didn't shout, didn't accuse. He simply stared at me, and it was as if I was seeing him for the first time, a stranger, someone I had once known but had grown apart from. "Balthasar," he repeated, the name tasting bitter on his tongue. He didn't need to know the details of our relationship, not really. The realization was all he needed to understand everything that had been building for months, maybe even years. My neglect, my absence. The way my heart had shifted, imperceptibly at first, but then with such force that I could no longer deny it. "I'm sorry," I said, the words feeling so small and insignificant in that moment. But it was all I could offer. I watched his expression change, his eyes clouding over with a mixture of hurt and disbelief. It was as though he was searching for the right words, but they kept slipping away from him, leaving only a silence that grew heavier with each passing second. I wanted to reach out, to hold him, to tell him that I regretted everything, that I hadn't meant for it to happen, but somehow, the distance between us felt impossible to bridge. "I thought I knew you, Alice," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I knew us." The pain in his words twisted something deep inside me, a kind of sorrow I hadn't been ready to face. How had I let it get to this point? How had I allowed my love for him to fade, slowly and silently, until it was nothing but a distant echo? I sat down beside him, but the space between us felt like an ocean. "I never wanted to hurt you," I said, my voice trembling. I never wanted to lose you. But the truth was, I had already lost him. Not in the sense that we were ending things right there, but in the way that our bond had eroded, piece by piece, over the months. I could feel it now, how much we had drifted apart, how much of me had wandered away while I was still here, in this house, this life that once felt like home. He looked at me then, his eyes hardening, as if a decision had been made. You think I don't know? You think I couldn't see what was happening? His voice cracked with something that sounded like anger but was layered with sorrow. I felt it, Alice. Every time you pulled away, every time you lied about where you were or who you were with. I felt it. The words hit harder than any accusation ever could. It was one thing for him to know, it was another to realize how long he'd known and how much he had been pretending, just as I had. We had both been playing this game, each of us pretending that everything was fine, when deep down, we both knew it wasn't. I'm sorry, I said again, but it felt hollow now. The apology had become meaningless because I knew it wasn't enough. It would never be enough to undo the damage I had caused, to make up for the emptiness I had created between us. He shook his head, standing up abruptly. I don't know if I can forgive you, he muttered, his voice low and resigned. Maybe not even for myself. But I don't know what this is anymore. I don't know what we are. And just like that, I felt my world shift on its axis. The ground beneath me seemed to tremble, and I realized too late that the thing I feared most had already happened. The damage had been done, and I had no way of taking it back. I watched him walk away, his silhouette fading into the hallway, and I couldn't help but feel the weight of my own choices pressing down on me. This wasn't just about Balthasar. This was about me, about everything I had neglected in my life, and how I had failed to see the one thing that truly mattered, the love and trust of the man who had been standing right in front of me all along. The regret was like a flood now, overwhelming and all-consuming. I had made my bed, and now I would have to lie in it, no matter how much I wished I could undo it all.